Well, where do I start and what do I say? God has taken home someone that was very special to me, my Uncle Jerry. And I know that he is truly home at last, and, well, someday we'll all be together again, but, it's hard to explain to others that, well, there's such a feeling that comes over me during times like these. I just can't explain it. You see, I like to listen to old gospel songs, and so did Jerry. We would talk about how many of those old songs are not played much anymore. So when you're listening to this memorial, you'll hear some of our favorites in the background. I figured he'll be listening too, and you'll notice quite a few references to the song as we go along. You see, for some reason, God, has given me a heart that feels everything so deeply, and my tears roll down so easy, but I understand that everything we do, say, or think he hears, that he's always by our sides every day and every night. And I'm sure he was with my Uncle Jerry and his girls, holding their hands during his struggle, and then he took them home. Well, there's a song called The Reach of His Hand by the Isaacs. And I'm sure that God reached down and said, Jerry, it's time for you to come home. Home to be with me and to see your earthly father William, your mother Sarah, your sister Mary again, and all your relatives. And I'm sure they've been waiting for you to come home. And you see, they are never farther than the reach of God's hand. I can just imagine the family reunion that must be going on right now with all the Benders and Kleinshauser, Ballmans, and many of the others who've gone on before. But when I went over and told my mother the news about her brother, she looked at me and said, I guess I'm next. You see, she's 90 now, and when I said I wish I could go back home, she said, I'm too old by that. And by now, the ones that I knew have all gone home already. I have to tell you about my Uncle Jerry. You see, I got a call from Kevin Hansen. Kevin was Uncle Jerry's son-in-law, and he and Leanne were my contact people to keep up on how Jerry was doing. When he called me to tell me that Uncle Jerry had passed, he said that Leanne wanted me to jot down some things about Uncle Jerry, and I assumed she wanted things about like where he was born, where he worked, that kind of thing. I told him I may not be the best source for that, and gave him one of Jerry's cousin's phone numbers to contact about this, as, they all grew up together in that same little general area in North Dakota. There were a lot of aunts and uncles and cousins who all seemed to be located very close to each other. You see, back then, no one ever traveled too far from home. I remember going to that little country church with Grandma. They weren't large farms, just a few acres, but they all seemed to raise a lot of kids. And I remember going to see some of them with Mom and Dad, and, they were always so happy and content with what they had. And boy, could they put on some fantastic home-cooked meals. Most everything was, either from their own garden or from their home-raised animals. Be it chickens, geese, cattle, or pigs, they all seemed to have a very special way of making everything taste so good. And if you left hungry, that was your own fault. They always put out more than anyone could eat. My memory's not what it used to be. Some things have disappeared or gone somewhere where I can't find them. But I do remember spending some time in the summers with my Grandma Sarah and Uncle Jerry. I remember one time when Uncle Jerry was driving home on those gravel roads, and Grandma would yell at him to slow down, and you know what? Uncle Jerry would just speed up and laugh, and Grandma would yell louder, and Jerry would laugh, but that didn't stop Uncle Jerry. He would just keep going just a little bit faster. I remember another time he was painting an old Ford. I think it was a 51. He was painting it with a paintbrush, and even before it was dry, he had to drive over and show the gross boys, but You know what happens when you drive on a gravel road and the paint's not quite dry? You know, that didn't seem to bother Uncle Jerry. And one of my fondest memories of Grandma was sitting down with her and Uncle Jerry and eating that fried chicken that only Grandma could make. Oh, to go back to those times and see her again. Wouldn't that be something? Well, Jerry was a loyal fan of Elvis, and he had tons of records in his collection. Collection that he was so proud to show them to me, but I remember one time when I stayed with him and Grandma, I walked into his room to see if he was ready, and he was combing his hair back, and well, he turned up his collar. He was trying to look like Elvis. And he always seemed to have a 45 going with one of Elvis's songs. Uncle Jerry was truly a special person and my best friend. He was the kind of a man who would give you whatever you asked for and then give you more. He always seemed to be happy, and he had a heart that was as big as a mountain. Well, as time passes, we moved away from home. But we made many trips back, and I will never forget the times I spent with my Uncle Jerry. You see, we'd come to Harvey with his trailer, and we'd barbecue and go fishing together. Oh, many times I remembered he wanted to fish for those darn little crappies. Well, he liked to eat them, and I always wanted to try and go somewhere else and get something a little bigger, but you know what? He always seemed to win, but that was okay. You see, I always felt that my time with him was special, and soon I would have to go home, and I wouldn't get to see him for a long time. Oh, we talked a lot on the phone over the years about what I was doing and about what he was doing. He enjoyed going to his girls' baseball games or watching his grandchildren play ball. He liked to play pool, and he was one of the best I ever saw. I was pretty good, but not good enough to come out on top when I played Uncle Jerry. He would tell me about the pool league he joined, and I could tell how excited he was to go and play in the tournament. One time I remember we played 100 games of snooker below Miller's clothing store in Harvey in one day. Jerry won 51 and I won 49. No matter how hard I tried to get one up on him, I always seemed to be one behind. He would drive down to Harvey, and he would go out to the Eagles and play pool, and then we'd have lunch, and we'd just visit, and he'd drive back home just to turn around and come back the next day and take me fishing. You know, I'm sure there were other things he could have been doing, but, well, he would always seem to be there when I wanted to go fishing. It was about 75 miles each way for him to drive, but as he always said, I like to drive. Well, Jerry and I are both diabetics, but I remember one time he picked me up and handed me a supersized Butterfinger candy bar. I told him, "Jerry, that's a lot of sugar." He laughed as only Jerry could, and, well, he said he ate one already on the trip to Harvard. And when my mother-in-law passed away, it was Uncle Jerry who met us late in the rainy night at the Minot Airport. Drove us all the way to Harvey. Then he turned around, drove back home that same night just to come back the very next day for Margaret's funeral. I asked him to bring one of his fishing rods for me to use, and since we came in on a plane, I didn't have room to bring one, and as usual, Jerry went and bought me a new one to use. So when we went home, he met us at the airport again to say goodbye, and I gave him the rod back and told him to save it for the next time. Well, during the drive to Harvey from Minot, I mentioned that I was going to buy 50 pounds of North Dakota sausage and take it home on the airplane, and he laughed and said, "That's a lot of sausage." And I explained to him that the airline had a limit of 50 pounds in the weight, and I hoped that it would fit in one suitcase. But you know what he did? The next day after the funeral was over and we were standing around talking to each other, he walked up to me and he handed me a receipt. Yes, he stopped on the way to the funeral and paid for the sausage for me. I believe it was $175. Now, how many people would do that? I'm sure he could have used the money for something else, but only Uncle Jerry would give you his last dollar with one of his big smiles. One of my best memories was our last trip back home. I got to spend 2 days and 1 night with Uncle Jerry at his house. He invited all his girls and their families over for what he called pig in the blankets. You see, Jerry was a fantastic cook. I remember he was making the pigs in the blankets that morning when I got up, and he was putting them in the fridge, and he said that way we can go fishing, and when we get home, all I have to do is put them in the oven. Oh, he packed us a lunch, which included those little Vienna sausages in a can, which I still love to this day. So we took off fishing, and we had a great day, but when we got home, we were sitting there just talking, and about 15 minutes before the girls were supposed to be there, he remembered he forgot to put the pigs in the oven. He was so mad at himself for forgetting, but it really didn't matter or make that much difference. So we ate a little later than we planned. Just gave me more time to visit with the girls. I really enjoyed seeing his 3 girls. They've all grown up, as in my memories they were still little girls, and now they have children and grandchildren of their own. Well, we talked late into the night and got up early. Jerry made me breakfast and packed us a lunch, and yes, we went fishing. Yeah, I seemed to know just where to go and how to get there, and I guess he had a built-in map after all these years of driving truck. We took many a shortcut as he seemed to know every road and where it went. Now, when I think back to this trip, I guess he was already getting tired as he didn't fish a lot. He sat in a lawn chair and put the fish on the stringer. You see, it was the kind of spot that most of us would just drive by and never stop. The kind where you could cast across to the other side, but there must have been a deep hole because I got a fish almost every cast. When I asked him if he wanted to head home, he would say, "Oh, just catch one more and then we'll go." He knew how much I liked to fish, and he wasn't thinking about himself. He only wanted me to have fun. Well, we took those fish home, and Uncle Jerry cleaned them, and he handed them out to his neighbors and friends. Uncle Jerry was one who liked to hear some of my recordings of what I call story songs. So I would burn some to a CD and mail them back to him, and then I found out that, well, he could only listen to them in the car, so I found an inexpensive boombox and mailed it to him. He said there were lots of nights that he had trouble sleeping, and he would get up and listen to them. I remember one time he was listening to some of my gospel songs, and he said, "Well, Don, you really nailed that Amazing Grace." I told him, I know I'm not the best singer, but I like sharing the messages that most all gospel songs contain. He said he was going to pass them on, or some of them on, to his cousin Russell. Our birthdays were both in September. For a number of years, he would send me something to do with Elvis, be it a little figurine or a flag with Elvis on it. And for many years, he would send me proof sets of various coins, and just this last Christmas, I passed them on to my grandchildren. Well, one of my goals this year was to try and save enough money to come home next year and go fishing with Uncle Jerry. But I guess that will have to wait until God calls me home. And I bet by then, well, Uncle Jerry will know exactly where to go to catch the big ones, or will it be those darn little crappies again? Who knows? Either way, it'll be great to be with them again. I remember one of my trips back home that Russell Kleinsasser was one of Jerry's cousins picked me up at Uncle Jerry. I think it was in Pheasanton one morning, and he brought his boat for us to go fishing at Devil's Lake. Well, I thought how Russell was a lot like my Uncle Jerry in so many ways. You see, he took the time from his busy farming schedule to take us fishing. Russell and his 2 sons farm a lot of acres. I remember that Uncle Jerry was a little nervous about going out in the boat. But when Russell backed up one time, the water came in over the back of the boat like it does, and Uncle Jerry thought something was wrong. I tried to explain that this is normal and drains out by the bottom of the motor mount, and I don't think he truly believed me. I remember after a fun day of fishing, we loaded the boat on the trailer and started to head home. But it was still light out, and like it does in North Dakota in the evening. Russell and Jerry knew how much I loved to fish, that Russell stopped by the side of the road so I could make a few more casts. And they just stood by the side of the truck and visited like they were in no big hurry to get back home. But you see, Devil's Lake is about 50 miles from Harvey, so they both had a few miles to go before they were home. Most of us would be anxious to get going home, but they seemed to be so happy just talking to each other and being together. That's one of the things that's different at home. People seem to not be too busy to spend time just talking with someone, and well, they'll go out of their way to share their time with someone else. I've always treasured this experience, and one of my trips back home, I went out to Russell's farm and spent some time with him and Janice. You see, they're on my grandmother's old farm. And I remember looking at the barn that was there so many years ago, when I used to stay with Grandma and Uncle Jerry, and well, I just walked around, and it was kind of like I could hear Grandma calling me and Uncle Jerry to come in for supper, or I could see her feeding the geese and chickens. Grandma was made so much more than 3 people could eat, but she was always so good to me. I remember she always gave us those lifesavers that, well, they looked kind of like a little book, and you'd open it up, and there were, I think, 8 or 10 rows. She also would give me Snicker candy bars. Back then, I never really liked them, but now when I do get one, I always think of her. On our trip back home in 2001, I remembered all of us sitting in my mother-in-law's place watching TV about what happened on 9/11. And we were talking about how we're going to have to change our return trip plane reservations, and Uncle Jerry said it's only he would do. He said, "Why don't I just drive you home? I like to drive." This has always made me think now, how many people, think about it, how many people would offer to drive you home if it was over 1,600 miles away and then have to drive back? Only Uncle Jerry would come up with something like this, and he actually meant it. Most people would have joked about it, but he was serious and would have actually done it if we said yes. Well, I got to tell you a little story. I was listening to music this morning, like I do most every morning. And I was listening to a song called "I Bowed on My Knees and Cried Holy." I remember something Jerry said in one of our phone conversations about how he fell to his knees one day when his heart must have flickered. Well, for just a second, and when I closed my eyes, it was like I was talking to Uncle Jerry. I wondered what was going through his mind at that very moment when he fell to his knees. Was this God's way of telling him to prepare himself and that he was coming soon to take him home? Oh, what I would give to make just one more fishing trip with Uncle Jerry. If only I had the time, if only I had the money, if only I didn't have to work. So many if only. Well, maybe it's time for all of us to start thinking about our if only or I wish I would have list. You see, life is short. Kind of like that little dash that's in between our birth date and the day we go home that's carved into the headstone. I remember a song or a poem called "The Dash." It said, I read of a man who stood to speak at a funeral of a friend. He referred to the dates on the tombstone from the beginning to the end. He noted that first came the date of birth and spoke the following date with tears in his eyes. But he said what mattered most of all was the little dash between those years. That dash represents all the time that they spent alive on earth. And now only those who love them know what that little dash or that little line is worth. For it matters not how much we own, the cars, the house, the cash. What matters is how we live and love and how we spend our dash. So think about this long and hard. Are there some things you'd like to change? For you never know how much time is left that it can still be rearranged. If we could just slow down enough to consider what's true and real and how us try to understand the way other people feel, and be less quick to anger and show appreciation more, and love the people in our lives like we never loved before. Well, if we treat each other with respect and more often wear a smile, remember that this special little dash might only last a little while. So when your eulogy is being read with your life's actions to rehash, would you be proud of the things they say, about how you spent your dash? Well, I think Uncle Jerry's family and friends can be proud of the way he spent his dash. He's always there to help someone else and always giving or sharing whatever he had with others. And that laugh of his and smile no matter what the circumstance. Even when I thought he was having some major life issues, he seemed to see what was ahead, not what was back. I remember saying about, don't look back, you're not going that way. Well, that's true. But if we don't look back and think of all the little things that mean so much in our lives, sometimes we wish we could see what tomorrow holds for us. But we should have faith in God that we will stand the test. If today we could see into tomorrow, we wouldn't only see the joys, we'd also see the sorrows. You see, only God knows what tomorrow holds. The road that you'll travel now may seem different without Uncle Jerry. But remember, it's kind of like another story about how you haven't reached the end of the road, you've only reached the bend in the road. And you see, there's more for you to do and many places to go, so take God's hand and walk around that bend in the road. But in closing, I have to tell you one more story. The other night, I was cleaning out my closet, and up on the top shelf, way in the back, I stumbled on a bunch of junk of mine in an old shoebox. Inside, there were some old ticket stubs and pictures when I was a little boy with Mom and Dad, some old newspaper clippings, a couple love poems, and some old letters, so I dumped them all out on the bed. And I found a homemade birthday card from Mom, and this is what it said. Don't forget the little moments are the ones that mean most. When you're gone and the way home seems so far away, take them out and hold them close, and don't forget the little moments we had. You see, it may be time for you to fill an old shoebox full of things to look back on. So look back on a little window to the past and look back on, well, God knows why life goes by so fast. If ever you should doubt the blessing that you've had, just don't forget the little moments you had with Jerry. They're the ones that mean the most. You see, when God calls someone close to us to dwell with Him above, we mortals, well, sometimes we question the wisdom of His love. For no heartache compares with the death of a loved one who does so much to make our world seem wonderful and mild. Perhaps God knows how much we needed them, but He takes the special ones to make the land of heaven more beautiful to view. For believing all this is difficult, and still somehow we must try. You see, the saddest word mankind knows will always be goodbye. So when a dear one departs, we who are left behind must realize that God loves all His children, and that really special kind of angels, well, they're hard to find. And may you find strength in the love of your family and in the warm embrace of friends. It'll be the little things that you'll remember, the quiet moments, the smiles, the laughter. And although it may seem hard right now, it will be the memories of these little things that help to push away the pain and bring the smile back again. So now, if you would bow your heads and feel free to say along. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in the green pasture. He leadeth me beside still waters, and he restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake, and yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies, and thou anointest my head with oil, and my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen.